Welcome back. This is Olivier Wagner from 1040 Abroad. I started operating 1040 Abroad since 2012, preparing returns for Americans who live overseas, helping them get into compliance and sometimes helping them with immigration questions along the way. I am targeting this call about Expatriating Act, which is again for people who want to get rid of their US citizenship and actually might have already done so. All right, let's dive in. Who is this presentation addressed to? So this would be for people who plan on renouncing, relinquishing US citizenship, especially for those who already acquired a foreign citizenship with the intent of relinquishing US citizenship. A common scenario is someone moved to Canada in the 1960s. A lot of people did that in reaction to the Vietnam War. They subsequently acquired Canadian citizenship. And what was interesting is that back then, neither Canada nor the US allowed dual citizenship. So it was pretty clear that they did so with the intent of relinquishing US citizenship. The law was always that you need intent to give up your US citizenship. Back then, it was assumed that it was the case. It was very hard for someone to convince the US consulate that it was not the case. Was now the assumption is the opposite, that you would acquire a foreign citizenship without necessarily intending to give up your US citizenship. So a lot of people did that. They moved to a foreign country, acquired foreign citizenship, and then stopped behaving as a US citizen, stopped voting in US elections or getting a US passport, never got a certificate of loss of nationality because it was widely understood that they were no longer a US citizen. And then in 2010, the US passed FATCA, obligating foreign banks to report information about their US citizen clients. And then they are put in this weird situation because they have a US place of birth, of having to convince the bank that they were not actually a US citizen anymore. The bank, of course, would like to see a certificate of loss of nationality that they don't have. So there's various expatriating acts that are set in the INA. The most common one is acquiring a foreign citizenship. Some oath taken alleging allegiance to a foreign state can constitute an expatriating act. Accepting employment serving to a foreign country can also serve as an expatriating act, especially if that's government level positions where you actually act on behalf of the foreign government. Likewise, employment in the military could also be an expatriating act. And what becomes really interesting is that various laws have been passed to regulate people giving up US citizenship, creating an exit tax to deem disposition of all of your assets from 8854, so that people would make a clean break from the US government. So this was Section 877 in 2004 and Section 877A in 2008. And what's interesting is that these laws were passed, applied to US citizens at the time. If you perform an expatriating act before this date and therefore was not a US citizen when this law was passed, logically these laws wouldn't apply to you. Which, as you can see, it's quite some interest to being able to demonstrate that you were not a US citizen when these laws were passed. Right, so back to our hypothetical taxpayer who had an expatriating act, stopped behaving as a US citizen since 1978, but doesn't have a certificate of loss of nationality and has been contacted by their bank. What can they do? There are three options. One is to obtain said certificates of loss of nationality. The second one is to do nothing. The third one is to renounce. The third one being available to anybody, as we spoke about yesterday. File 5 years of tax return, go to the consulate, renounce, and then you'll stop being a US citizen as of that day. You'll file Form 8854 and the dual status return. The first one is, again, to make an appointment at the consulate. That's what is going to lead to this golden paper, the certificate of lost nationality, backdated to a date before 2004, and therefore have a clean break from the US government without having to file tax returns. So if you can get that certificate of loss of nationality, that's the most desirable outcome. The hurdle you have to cross is that you indeed need to convince the consulate that is what happened. You stop being a US citizen because when you perform the Expatriating Act, you did so with the intent of giving up your US citizenship. Furthermore, you stop behaving as a US citizen. If you applied for a US passport, voted in US election, even if it was a decade or two after the Expatriating Act, that would show that you still considered yourself as a US citizen because only US citizens can get a US passport, for instance. So if you applied for a US passport after the Expatriating Act, the chances of a backdated CLN being issued to you are dropping quickly. They're pretty close to zero. And that's really unfortunate because oftentimes border officers were not informed about the matter, and they told people that they needed US passports to go to the US. And people, while they stopped considering themselves to be a US citizen, they applied for a US passport based on the advice of a US border officer. And by doing so, they completely got the chances of getting a backdated CLN to vanish to zero. It is the best course of action if you can get it. There is no compliance cost to prepare a US tax return. There is no exit tax, no Form 8854. You won't be a covered expatriate because your Expatriating Act happened before all of these laws were passed. It used to be that there was no fee for a relinquishment. The fee of $2,350 has since been matched for both renunciation and relinquishment. So that is no longer a reason to relinquish, but that would be the only fee you have. You won't have compliance cost or have to pay an exit tax. So it's still a very good proposition. The second alternative is to do nothing. You're not a US citizen. You don't have to prove it to anyone. You simply don't do anything. One of the advantage is that it's free. You don't have to do anything. A disadvantage is that it lacks certainty. You have this position, you document it, but you don't have the CLN, which would be the word of the US government, backing your position and certifying that they agree with you. So if challenged, you cannot guarantee that you would prevail. And since we live in a FATCA world and banks might contact you to get information as to whether you're a US citizen or not, and therefore forward your information to the IRS or not, there are ways to certify that you're not a US citizen in the context of FATCA, and therefore have your information not being sent to the IRS. In practice, financial institution might not agree with you. And so while they would necessarily agree with you if you can show a CLN, they might not agree with you if you simply self-certify. The third option is to not try to convince the government that you gave up your US citizenship at the time of the Expatriating Act, and instead renounce, which would mean that you would give up your US citizenship as of the date of the appointment. That means that you need to have filed 5 years of tax returns. You need to have made sure that you are not a covered expatriate. You understood the consequence of renouncing and what that would mean for Form 8854 as well as the exit tax. It is straightforward. You don't need to convince of what your intent was, what your behavior has been since, and you will have an approval rate of close to 100% as an adult. It's the most certain course of action, but it's also the most costly because you would have the compliance cost, maybe an exit tax, and you still have to pay the $2,350 fee to the US consulate. All right, that's all for today. If you have any question about this topic or any other, feel free to send me an email. Thank you so much. Have a good one.